Have you ever looked at a government decision and just thought, why would they do that? It's obviously a terrible idea. Well, today we're going to explore that exact question. We're looking at a hypothetical US-Iran war, not just as a crisis, but through the lens of a really powerful historical theory that explains why powerful nations sometimes make these truly catastrophic choices that go completely against their own best interests. All right, let's get into it.
So let's set the stage. We're starting with a scenario from a fascinating, though fictional, article. It imagines a near future where a US-led war on Iran has just completely spiraled out of control.
And right from the jump, the source's own words tell you what's wrong. It's a war of choice, where the goals are constantly changing. This isn't some conflict with a clear mission. No, this is a crisis that's basically defined by its own chaos.
And the results? Well, they're pretty much what you'd expect from a war with no real plan. The whole goal of regime change? Not happening. In fact, Iran is fighting back pretty effectively, hitting oil infrastructure and throwing global markets into a total panic. Back home, people are turning against the war, and even our allies in the Gulf are basically begging Washington to find an off-ramp. You know, the biggest problem here is that there is absolutely no endgame in sight.
So this gets to the heart of it, right? This isn't just about one hypothetical war. It's about a pattern we see over and over. How does a superpower, with all its intelligence and resources, just walk straight into a disaster that seems to hurt itself more than anyone else?
All right, so here's our game plan. We've laid out the crisis. Next, we're going to introduce this theory of folly, break down the 3 tests that define it, and then apply those tests to this war scenario. We'll see what it tells us about this timeless pattern of political failure.
To really understand what's happening, we need to shift gears a little, move from geopolitics to history. Because there's this brilliant intellectual tool that helps make sense of exactly these kinds of political disasters.
And the key to this whole thing comes from a book by the historian Barbara Tuchman called The March of Folly. I mean, she spent her entire career studying this exact problem. Why do leaders so often act against their own best interests?
That is a powerful, almost brutal quote from Tuchman, isn't it? Her whole point is that for all the amazing things humanity can do, we're just consistently bad at the basic act of governing ourselves wisely. And that idea is the cornerstone of her whole theory.
So what does she actually mean by folly? Well, she has a very specific definition. It's not just any mistake or a bad decision. Folly is when a government actively pursues a policy that anyone could see as directly hurting the country and its people.
But here's the best part. Tuchman didn't just leave it as some vague idea. She came up with a clear framework, a set of 3 specific tests to figure out if a policy really truly counts as an act of folly.
Okay, these 3 tests are our toolkit. First, people had to know it was a bad idea as it was happening. Hindsight is 20/20, right? So this is a crucial test. Second, there had to be another, better option available. If it's the only choice, it might be a tragedy, but it's not a folly. And third, it has to be a group decision. This separates it from just the random whim of a single dictator.
Okay, now for the fun part. Let's take this framework and put our hypothetical war to the test. Does this fictional, but frankly plausible disaster actually pass Tuchman's 3 tests for folly?
All right, first question. Was this whole thing seen as a bad move while it was going on? Or does it only look that way now, looking back? The evidence here is just overwhelming. The policy didn't achieve its main goal, it kicked off an energy crisis, and public opinion turned against it. Even America's allies were pushing for the conflict to end. The key point is, none of this was a surprise. The negative consequences were happening in real time for everyone to see. So for test number 1, that's a definite yes.
Okay, let's move on to the second test. Was this war the only option? Or was there another, perfectly good path that was just ignored?
And you can really see the 2 paths laid out here. They couldn't be more different. On one side, you have this costly, chaotic war, and on the other, a diplomatic option that wasn't just possible, it was actually happening. According to the article, talks were right at a point of breakthrough, with Iran offering up major concessions.
So yeah, the conclusion here is pretty much a slam dunk. There was a workable and probably much better alternative right there on the table. The decision was made to deliberately ignore diplomacy and choose conflict instead. So test number 2 gets a resounding yes.
And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. Was this disastrous choice just the action of one person, or was it the policy of a whole group?
And yep, this one checks out too. While the president made the final call, the source makes it clear the decision was made with allies like Israel's prime minister and pushed by hawkish advisors. It was a group effort, a collective folly.
Okay, so we've run the hypothetical war through all three of Tuchman's tests. Now we can come to a verdict and think about what it all really means.
So what's the verdict?
It's pretty clear. This war scenario is a textbook example of a modern-day governmental folly. It was seen as a bad idea at the time, there was a better alternative, and it was the result of a group policy. It checks every single box.
And man, this quote from the article, it just says it all, doesn't it? It perfectly captures the absolute futility of the whole thing. It shows how the war didn't just fail, it failed in this spectacular, self-defeating way, achieving absolutely nothing at an enormous cost.
And that's really the big takeaway here. Tuchman's framework is so incredibly useful because it lets us step back from just one crisis and see this timeless, repeating pattern. I mean, from the Trojan War to Vietnam to this hypothetical conflict, the March of Folly just keeps on going.
Which leaves us with the ultimate question, one that Tuchman herself struggled with. If this pattern is so obvious all through history, why on earth do governments and leaders keep falling into the exact same trap? Why do they keep chasing policies that are so clearly against the very interests they're supposed to be protecting? That's the huge, lingering question her work forces all of us to think about.